And we are live
Welcome back
to the Explore Simplexity podcast.
So our topic for today, we're going to talk about the evolution of sexual desire, specifically sexual selection, and the idea. Well, first of all, I guess we'll talk about just general natural selection. I think we've talked about this a little before. There are different like layers of selection happening.
Yeah, definitely. Biology needs to needs to figure out how to survive and reproduce. Technical difficulties. Sorry about that. So there's lots of different demands and needs that need to be met, and strategies to pass along your information.
Mm-hmm.
So one of them is just the survival of the fittest. Like, don't die.
Mm-hmm.
That's like step one. But almost as important is, replicate, reproduce. So.
Yeah, so natural selection, the idea is that the environment is what is doing the selecting. So there's this famous experiment of they had these trees that were white, and there was these white moths, and every once in a while there was a black moth. And then soot covered these trees and made them black during the Industrial Revolution. So then all the white moths got picked off by birds, and the black moths multiplied. And so the change in the environment made certain genes more prominent in the population.
Right. It was having black or darker wings was like a fitness payoff to camouflage in contrast to the white ones.
Right.
So just totally environmentally dependent, but it was also dependent upon having a predator in like an ecosystem of survival, which is super cool to think about how these things aren't just in isolation. Like, can I find food? But it's can I protect myself from predation as well? Yeah.
One book I really liked is Dawkins' book called The Greatest Show on Earth. And so he started out as being a really aggressive atheist, saying, evolution is true and anyone trying to take it out of schools is superstitious. But there had never been like a single book that just laid out evolutionary theory in a really elegant way. And so he decided to take it on himself to write this book. And it's really well written and has a lot of great illustrations, and I really like it. So yeah, The Greatest Show on Earth is a really good book. And so he actually mirrors Darwin's explanation of talking about agriculture, because farmers have always been like taking seeds of fertile plants and like using those for the next generation, which is an artificial selection, right? Or when people are breeding dogs, they're like, okay, yeah, we'll take the healthiest one and have that one, breed.
Right.
And so he argues, well, hey, if people can do this with their crops and their pets deliberately, it makes sense that the environment would do that too. So if it becomes, shifting changes in the environments benefit some and like harm others. And so that's what natural selection is when nature or the environment changes, and then certain features or characteristics allow reproduction and survival.
Absolutely. And I just think the whole concept of evolution and survival given a certain set of context is a super powerful way to understand how things come to be, especially in terms of biological life. Ranging from all the way down to genes in these small little bacterium to very complex forms. And even we can think about, capitalist markets, as we always often talk about. It's survival of the fittest or survival of the most profitable, cutting costs and providing something that's in a demand, and whatever that the environment is the market and the people. So you can use these same sorts of concepts again and again. And I think it's super powerful and compelling.
Yeah, for sure. And there are, of course, what would you say, limits, right? It's not universally true for everything all the time. True. And one of the more disastrous examples of that is, of course, like this social Darwinism and like as used to like rationalize, Nazi atrocities, that might makes right. And I mentioned that quote the other day, the strong take what they will and the weak suffer what they must.
Okay, right. So that's the concept of social Darwinism.
Yeah, right. It's like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't apply it to that context.
Right. But there's also kind of like a humorous thing that people have joked about in terms of like, have you heard of the Darwin Awards?
Oh, yeah.
Right. Basically, it's like this idiocracy thing, but they don't reproduce because they do something so stupid that they've been selected out. So I think it's like very common terminology that a lot of people are familiar with, but the intricacies of how those can play out in terms of the pressures, environmental pressures, social pressures, and reproductive pressures, like we're going to get into in a little bit here. It's really cool how they all intertwine.
Yeah, well, and another movie is Idiocracy, and the premise of that movie is that there's so much technology and convenience that there's no longer pressure for people to like compete and be like high quality people.
Yeah.
And it's like the Darwin Awards, but they don't happen.
Right. Well,
it's an interesting premise.
Totally. Because the idea was that the environmental context has changed so much. The things that made you competitive and survive and being able to reproduce didn't matter. That's not at all what mattered about survival and making more babies. It was changed totally to a different thing based on this culture of convenience, like you said.
Yeah.
Just, like this make everything as easy as possible. Like they even had a guy. Well, I mean, we can quote this movie forever. But one of my favorite scenes is when this guy, like the first person that this guy from the past is introduced to, he like crashes into this guy's apartment and he's sitting on his like lazy boy and he's got like a toilet built into his recliner.
Yeah.
And he's eating from a tube coming from a wall, like some kind of like butter paste.
Yeah.
And watching the Baiter channel, or I'm baiting
out my balls,
like all this, like as lowbrow and convenient as you can get. And when he went to go like put on clothes, there was like a box of like disposable shirts. You just pull one out and like put it on.
Looked like a Kleenex dispenser,
like some spandex thing. But it was great because it was like showing like how an evolutionary process could occur if we continue down this path. It's a great like what if, but in a satirical way.
Right, it's extreme for sure. So on to sexual selection is the idea that like a man picks who the woman he's going to be with and the woman picks the man she's going to be with. So this idea that the gender sexual interaction is a selection mechanism too. And I think the one that Darwin talked about, or maybe it was Dawkins, I'm getting them confused, but it's the idea of the peacock feathers. It's like, where in the world do peacocks get these crazy feathers from? And one idea is that the female peahen picks the male with the most beautiful feathers. So then they're like competing to have these feathers.
Right.
And that sexual selection is actually what drives the extravagant mating display.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like different species and even different like kingdoms of species have evolved to favor certain kinds of strategies. So in terms of birds, I'm not 100% sure why, but it tends to be that the male is trying to impress the female, and either visually with different colors or with some kind of dance or some kind of pattern that he can do really well. Or probably the most common one is the bird song, where if they can make a repeated pattern of sounds and like hit the mark every single time, it's an auditory cue of the fitness of the male.
Yeah.
And it seems to be very common throughout the bird kingdom. So the female birds typically don't look as flashy because that's not what they're selected for.
Right.
They're selected for different characteristics.
Yeah, it's interesting. And so in humans, women are typically selected for beauty and men are typically selected for competence. And it's interesting because like once you know that, it's so you could analyze like your own unconscious attractions, but also just like why people are the way they are.
So being selected I like, yeah, the idea of beauty and competence. Those are the things you can kind of observe on the surface in terms of interacting with someone, either just like looking at the person or seeing how well they play baseball or whatever the thing is. But then those are signaling underlying things that might be more specific to like genetic fitness and reproductive fitness. Like beauty, the idea of like symmetry, meaning we don't have a lot of weird mutations and my genes are pretty healthy and working well and all that kind of thing. And then competence is I can go out and provide and figure and protect and figure out how to cope with the dangers of the world. Yeah.
Yeah, so David Buss has done a lot of work on the evolution of desire. Actually, I think it's one of his books. He has like literal textbooks on evolutionary psychology. I think he like founded the field of evolutionary psychology. And
Could be. I know he's a huge name.
and he's written like, I don't know, 200 papers or something insane. So he's like massively productive. And so yeah, so he talks a lot about how, what are the sexual cues for women? What are they looking for? And then what are the sexual cues for men? What are they looking for? It also gets super complicated too when you add in things like estrous cycles and
Yeah.
which could be another fertility cue, right? If someone is available or not. And then he also describes short-term and long-term mating strategies. So the idea is that a long-term strategy is that, I'm going to partner with this person. We're going to build a life over, decades. And then the short-term strategy is like, we need to reproduce now. And you can track, like, if there's, either stressors in the individual's life, like there's these studies where young women who are, let's say they're battered, then they tend to go into puberty earlier and they mate more frequently. And it's almost like there's this epigenetic switch that says, times are rough, you better get cracking. Like there's no time for long-term investment.
Makes sense. So the context of the environment determines the mating strategy for whatever the individual is. And it's, I'm guessing, probably a totally subconscious process.
For sure.
It's the internal drives that kind of push the person to that state.
Yeah, for sure. And so that's really interesting. So men and women both have long-term and short-term strategies, and they also have like cues and triggers that would turn them on. And that is just fascinating to me. So definitely read these books if you're interested in them. So what else? So another book I really liked was called A Billion Wicked Thoughts, and it talks about sexual desire. But what's fascinating is the authors look at Google porn searches. And the idea is that people are reluctant to disclose or talk about what they really want or what they're really attracted to. And so as a scientist, like creating a survey that like elicits the truth can be tricky.
Yeah.
So, but if you just look at porn data, then like that'll give you a lot of like honest information.
Right.
And so two things, well, a lot of things came out of this book. So one is, which should be obvious, sexually, men are aroused by visual cues mostly. And so men tend to search out porn that's visual, which kind of goes to this beauty thing, right? There are these visual markers that turn a man on. And you could also argue this is like a short-term strategy, right? Like you're just getting a quick arousal, quick dopamine hit. So visual cues are like a short-term arousal. But what was interesting for women, they aren't as visual. They actually are into narrative. So lady porn tends to be like Harlequin romance novels or the like slash fiction or, the what do they call it? Where people write their own fiction online.
Fan fiction?
Fan fiction, right. Yeah. So that is kind of like lady porn is this, it's much more psychological than it is visual.
Right. And yeah, I feel like a lot of it too, well, I guess maybe this is just porn in general, maybe for both sexes, but there's this like forbidden side that also seems to be much more attractive. Like, but there was a huge spike in interest with, well, there was a famous book that came out in that movie, that like 50 Shades of Grey.
Mm-hmm.
There was like a huge, it got like super popular and it came out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
But it seemed like when you looked at some of these, first the success of the book and the movie, and then, you know, if you go on Reddit and look at some of these like conversations about it, there's a lot of these underlying maybe desires, thoughts, and ideas that people have but aren't talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like this billion wicked thoughts thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole taboo thing seems to be something that is attractive to a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, there is like a mystique,
Mm-hmm.
or, you know, the forbidden fruit kind of thing. Like, I want it because it's forbidden, like a kind of rebellious, nonconformist thing. So that's true for sure. But also, like, my understanding of 50 Shades of Grey is that it started out as a fan fiction where someone had taken like a particular, I don't remember what the original was, but they like took a plot line, and then the author would like create these fan fictions and like add sexual elements to it. And then, you know, you just get practice writing for hours and hours and hours online. And eventually you compile a novel and you already have your, what'd you call it? Like you've tested the market to see that people like it, and then you publish it.
Yeah.
It's like a garage band practicing for years, and then, you know, a record label picks them up and they go mainstream.
Yeah. That is pretty cool. But the reason I brought that up is to kind of also reiterate the original point you were making, that, you know, women tend to like the narrative kinds of porn, or some kind of story behind it, or some kind of like taboo thing. It's more like psychological, right? And I feel like that 50 Shades of Grey and what like the, you know, BDSM kind of thing is very like in your head rather than just straight up visual.
Yeah. Yeah. So one thing I also wanted to talk about too that this book mentioned is that men tend to have like one cue. Not always, but like they talk about their type. Like, this is my type, and it tends to be pretty hardwired during a like developmental window. There's like this critical period of development where like you have your type, and that's like what turns you on.
Yeah, it's like you're imprinted or something.
Yeah, but for women, they have like 5 different things that need to happen simultaneously.
Okay.
And so it's not like one cue. There's like a combination of, you're thinking about music, like you're creating a chord of notes and they all have to jive. Otherwise the turn on isn't there. And the idea is that women tend to be more choosy because they have to take on the burden of childbearing.
Right.
And so they have like these different gates that have to, or boxes to have to check. And once all those boxes are checked, it's like, okay, now I'm open. And so the book explores those different things. And we've already talked about a little bit. Like, one of this is this idea of providing, right? So someone's providing, someone who's strong, they can protect, someone who's social and reciprocal. And then trying to remember what the other ones were. But you can see this in fantasy, these fantasy stories where you get someone who's like a billionaire or like a vampire. and so they're really powerful, just like alpha male, totally dominated.
James Bond.
Yeah. And then they meet like an average woman and they just completely fall in love with her and become like a puppy dog.
Right.
And this is kind of like hitting all these cues, like, oh yeah, he's an alpha male and he's dominant, but he's just like putty in my hands. He's all about me.
Yeah.
And once you hit those cues, this really turns a woman on. And this is like, and I don't think, I mean, maybe they're doing it consciously, but like this is kind of evolved out of the literature, these fantasy novels that sell. But anyways, yeah. So like, rationally speaking, like these are fantastic characters, right? They don't exist. Like, no, but it's also like it's almost like an anime exaggeration, like some pornographic images. What do they call them? Like they're hyper stimulating. So those are like visually hyper stimulating,
like a caricature.
Yeah,
What's
right.
Yeah.
So these romance novels are like psychologically hyper stimulating. right? There are no vampires that can like read your mind, like. But the fantasy of this is like hyper stimulating.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, and then the anime's got some weird tentacle things going on. With like, I'm guessing that's still has to do something to do with control or loss of control.
Could be, yeah.
Something in that area. So also, but I mean, the thing is, there's so much repertoire out there, and there's so many, you know, strange things that people get into. But one common one, so we talk about like, you know, like James Bond or like the billionaire type or the whatever. But then there's also these stories of like, you know, the princess who falls in love with like the farm boy or like the commoner.
Well, yeah, like was it the Princess Bride?
Princess Bride, farm boy.
Exactly.
But there's more. I've seen several of those kinds of dynamics.
Yeah, well, that's slightly. So we talk about short-term and long-term mating strategies. Like that's the technical language or jargon for evolutionary theory.
Yeah.
But like a long-term mating strategy is just a romantic monogamous relationship.
Yeah.
And yeah, and for sure. And there's also the Beauty and the Beast story, right? So you have this guy that's kind of like gruff and mean, and
Yeah.
he meets a girl, and she kind of like tames him, and he becomes more civilized, and they create a life together.
Right. Right. So I guess those are just, yeah. So this is maybe not like a explicitly like trying to exploit the sexual attraction drive. This is more of like a long-term romance story or fable about patience and growing together in a relationship and like this couple thing. When it comes to like the sexual part, at least with like these fantasies, that's not really like at the top of the list. These
Well,
like long-term stable mature relationships, like we'll live together forever. That's like you said, maybe a little different. But
well, like one of the most famous movies of all time is Titanic. And you could argue that whole thing is just like this crazy romance,
Yeah.
right? Between
and the same thing,
the farm boy,
aristocrat,
yeah,
yes.
and the aristocrat.
Yeah, I know it comes up again and again. Yeah.
And that's a type of passionate romance. But in terms of evolutionary theory, if you want to use that lens, the idea is, you know, you want to find a partner that's going to love you and be loyal to you so that you can raise healthy children in a stable environment. And so there's that interpersonal romantic love for sure, and that evolutionarily leads to raising kids. So it's not like, so I mean, you could look at the romance in isolation, and you could look at the fling in isolation,
Yeah.
but these are like all pieces of a bigger puzzle.
Absolutely. And I'm assuming maybe the context in which the individual is in can change. So like if you are in this, like just use Titanic again, you're like in this Kate Winslet, like uppity society, your whole family's stuck up and they've got all these like pretentious things and you're just like sick of that life. And then you meet someone who's like so free and genuine and honest or something like that. So, and then maybe it's the other way around, you know, like the pauper is enamored with the life of the nobility and, you know, grass is greener on the other side. So some of that could be playing a role. So there's maybe population drives of, you know, generally men have this strategy for, you know, sexual selection and attraction, and women have this strategy and they have like general strategies, but then there's lots of individual differences based on culture and all those kind of things.
Well, yeah, temperament, imprinting, association, for sure. Yeah, it gets complicated. But it also too, so men's one of the interesting things that Buss looks at is jealousy. It's like, what's that about? And they call it mate guarding or mate protecting. And men tend to get jealous of a woman who's flirting with other guys, but women tend to get jealous of men who are romantically like falling in love with another woman. And the idea is because the man is like focused on, you know, so the idea is the woman carries the child and she she knows like who the father is, let's say, and this idea of cuckolding, where the man may not know who exactly the father is, and so he needs to make sure I'm investing in my kid.
Right.
And so that's why men are more like,
did you sleep with him?
That's right. Just insanely jealous over like sexual jealousy of the physical intimacy. Whereas women, because what they're aiming for in a long-term relationship is security and stability in a relationship, the cue for that is love. It's like, well, if he loves me, he's going to stick with me, which makes sense. But if he starts falling in love with another woman, it's like unconsciously or consciously, like he's going to leave me for her because he's in love.
Right. And then I'll have this kid without someone to provide and protect in terms of like typical standard human development. You know, killing a jaguar and doing all that stuff.
Yeah. So it's fascinating that like both genders experience jealousy, but like in a different dimension.
What's relevant to their, I mean, on average, their survival cues and reproductive fitness. And with that, it's a really interesting argument, is that's what it all really boils down to. Can I reproduce and can I survive?
Yeah,
or not die.
It could be a little reductionist. That's like the definition. If you say everything boils down to one thing,
I know. It's so tempting to do.
It is tempting, but it seems to be a useful theory and a lens, and you know, if it works over and over again, it's very tempting to continue the reasoning. Shoot. I was going to make a point. We're talking about jealousy, and then we're talking about mate guarding, and so another really question that people have scientifically and personally, or you know, culturally, is the question: are humans a monogamous species? Right? Is that like in our DNA? Is that our nature, or are we like promiscuous by nature? Are we like serial monogamists?
Right. And then culture will try to like wrangle that whatever natural desire into something that's unnatural, or whatever you want to call that.
Right. So one narrative is, you know, we're like the bonobos. We just love having sex with everybody, but culture is mean and oppressive and like forces us to do stuff we don't really want, but we go along with it because we have to. And then the other extreme, it's like, no, we're monogamous by nature, and the only reason someone wouldn't fall in love with a partner is because they're jaded or hurt or they're twisted and have some sort of emotional wound that they need to heal from. Otherwise, they would naturally prefer monogamy, and that's the natural and good way of being.
Right.
And like both arguments are pretty compelling, and the question is, what is, you know, what is our nature? What is human nature? And there might be, you know, variation in terms of human, individual differences, for sure.
Yeah. Another flavor of that I've heard is also this concept of like serial monogamy. So that's just kind of somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
And I've heard some evolutionary arguments of how that could make sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's the short-term, long-term strategies which seem to be like built in. So there's that idea in terms of evolution. I saw this fascinating talk, and I can't remember the scientist, but if I find it, I'll post it in the description. But I remember the finding. So they had these field mice, and they were like genetic cousins, and one of the field mice was monogamous, right? They would just mate for life, and the other was just completely promiscuous. Like every season, they'd have a new partner and a new litter, and then they'd go out and then a new partner and new litter. And so what these scientists did was they said, okay, well, what's like they're like genetic cousins. Like what causes this difference?
Was this like in a controlled laboratory environment where they only gave access to one partner to these field mice, and then they also gave access?
No. This is like how they operate
they just
in nature.
chose whatever. Yeah.
So they have these two subspecies that you know, one is monogamous and the other, like, they mate for life.
That's just how they behave.
That's just how they behave. Okay. And another one is just, you know, promiscuous and so they thought, okay, they're genetically very similar, but their behaviors are different. Like, so what what's the difference in the genome, and so they manipulated that in the experiment. And they did this like hybridization thing, and then they looked at like the overlap between the hybrids, and then like took a sample of their DNA. And so anyways, the point was they were investigating this question of, is there a biological element to monogamy versus non-monogamy? Like, what is that in nature? And it came down to vasopressin. That was like I don't know if it's a hormone or I think it's a
neurotransmitter. Yeah.
So that
hormone that acts as neurotransmitter as well.
Yeah. So I'll look up the study, but it was really, really interesting to me. And they didn't go into a whole lot of like why, in terms of like, okay, so why? Actually, they did. So the idea is that the more that you have to invest in your young, the more that monogamy becomes a necessity. And then the less that you invest in your young, then it's less useful.
Okay. And then they link that to the vasopressin signaling somehow?
That's the biological thing that the distinction between the two groups.
And so is this, but they were just tracking the males too. But I mean, females, I guess for mice, it's, yeah. Because, I mean, females can also have a monogamous or polygamous preference and strategy as well. So there's always like two sides of the coin.
For sure.
But I guess this one was specifically looking at male patterns.
Yeah.
These mice.
I don't remember exactly, but yeah, I think so. And the key was like parental investment. So the more that the parents have to invest, then the more likely that monogamy becomes a necessity.
Okay. And then presumably there was some idea of where one mouse that was monogamous maybe had a higher pressure to maintain their progeny.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
But yeah, I'd be curious because that could be very interesting. Finding depending on the details.
But back to humans. So there's this famous book called Sex at Dawn, and it's essentially arguing that we're bonobos and arguing for that free love is natural. And my sense is that seems like, what would you call it? Wishful thinking. Like somebody like wants it to be this way, and is like kind of trying to cobble together evidence to like support this free love view.
Yeah.
And my view is that humans are at least serial monogamists because they have long-term investment in their young, and also families tend to have multiple children, and that seems to also be an optimization, right? You figure out how to take care of one kid, and then you have another kid, and you have another kid, so that can be optimized with a monogamous partner.
Yeah. I also wonder if it depends on the society and culture, or maybe the technological advancement level. Like what kind of setup would be most optimal for survival?
Oh yeah. So here's something that's fascinating. So there's this idea of, what do they call it? Semen competition.
Okay. Like the fastest sperm wins or something?
Yeah. So we talked about, the peacock feathers, where they have these like crazy evolutionary cycles where they just get more and more extravagant to attract the females. And we might have discussed this, I don't remember, but they did this correlation between different species of apes and monkeys, and they found out that like great apes tend to have like an alpha male that like dominates a harem of women, and they tend to have very small testicles. And then you have,
I think you did have an anecdote for this.
And then bonobos, who have this kind of like free love society, they tend to have very large testicles. And the idea is that with gorillas, the competition is physical, right? I'm gonna beat you up. I'm gonna protect my harem, and then I'll just get the females to myself. With the bonobos, it's
can I seduce or something?
No. So the idea is, essentially, if you have a gangbang, let's call it that, somebody's going to be the winner. So who gets to be the winner?
The most desirable one?
Well,
The
so
biggest one.
yeah, so there's this like competition between like shooting the biggest load and like having and actually some people argue that the evolution of the shape of the penis is to function as a sort of shovel.
Yeah.
So like one male tries to impregnate a female, and then that is a cue of arousal for a competing male. So he'll like shovel out the previous guy's stuff and input his stuff.
Right.
And it makes sense. It does make sense that is a sort of competition.
Right. In a totally different social, cultural context of what's going on. Yeah. Absolutely. Because, in terms of humans, I'm thinking, there's like this Genghis Khan situation.
Yeah. Okay. Right? Yeah. So with that framework in mind, culturally speaking, there are some harem cultures where the idea where you have an emperor who has like 50 concubines, or like Genghis Khan with hundreds of women, or some sultan with multiple wives, or a king with multiple wives. That's not uncommon culturally, and you could argue, well, that we're definitely more like that. But then you also have cultures where monogamy is the norm. Getting back to this question, are we naturally monogamous or not? Are we this like polyamorous, or are we like harem? And like, how much of that is culture and how much of it is biology? Anyway, there's this interesting study that shows that when you have a harem culture, the young men tend to be more violent. And the idea is that they're competing for women.
Yeah.
And because it's this like brawn versus brawn, like I'm going to be the alpha male, that has more violence in those societies.
So maybe it's not a coincidence that it's like these kings and sultans and emperors that have these kinds of mating strategies, these huge harems, because this is very much like huge separation, or like alpha male versus a bunch of other,
like winner take all
sort of situation. Less what is it? There's a huge separation in resources basically across the population.
And then the converse is that societies that tend to be monogamous tend to be more peaceful. And you could think of it as a sort of social technology, and like whether it's our nature or culture, I'm not sure, or whether it's an adaptation like in the cultural space, maybe. And what's really interesting is if you think about the 10 commandments, like one of them is do not commit adultery. And like, why? Well, because if you do, people tend to get pissed off and murderous. So if we want to reduce murder, we want to reduce conflict, let's not sleep around.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. That's very interesting. But now when I'm thinking about this too, thinking about, like the way that the societies or governments are set up, it seemed like monogamy and those kind of relationships were much more prominent and kind of put forward in like this, like the Protestant idea of equality. Since we talked about nationalism last time, like liberalism, and everyone is less equal. There's not these like huge, powerful individuals and like the peasantry, and that kind of idea of monogamy maybe because we're more or less equal, rather than this huge separation of power and then the powerful take everything.
Yeah, well, okay, so it's interesting in terms of like the history of marriage. So for a long time, marriage was really only for the aristocrats and the elite, in the sense that you need to transfer wealth, you need to have heirs, and like marriage is like political alliances. Anthony and Cleopatra, like the Habsburgs, like all these sort of political alliances through marriage. So it wasn't so much about romance or family per se. And then you have this like universalizing idea. And I think monogamous marriage has been around for a long time, but then it became like a sacrament in the Catholic Church, and then like the Protestant tradition too. The Catholic Church is weird because they have celibate priests, but we'll table that for another day.
Maybe along with the tentacles.
Yeah, that's the other extreme.
Just stay
celibacy and ascetic monks. what was I going to say? Oh, but in terms of like mythological tropes, this is exactly the King Arthur story.
Mm.
Um, there's this book called, I think it's called Romance of the Grail, and it's actually written by Joseph Campbell. And one of the things he talks about is how that story archetypally represents this friction between your duty as a king to marry a woman within, as a political alliance to your as a duty to your nation versus the person that you're in love with and you want to be with. And there's this tension in that story, right? Famously, the Guinevere and Lancelot, Arthur love triangle,
Yeah.
is exactly that. It's like, is it your duty or is it your love? Like, what's your highest value? And that's been a struggle for a long time.
Yeah, that's interesting in terms of the evolutionary pressures and the idea of monogamy and polygamy and those kinds of things too. Like, well, no, I'll table that for another time as well. I would just think about love triangles, and we were talking about how women tend to like those kinds of dramatizations more, and then, but anyways.
Well, and we can loop it in. So the idea usually is that the one of the men represent the long-term strategy and the other represents the short-term strategy.
Right.
So the long-term strategy guy is the one who has money, he's stable,
Right.
and then the short-term strategy guy, he's hot, he's young, he's creative, he's intense.
Right.
And so then she's like caught between like, what do I do? And
that's right. Yeah, it makes a good story. It's like, I don't want to choose one or the other. It's like, why not both? And that's the fun fantasy story that sells really well.
Yeah, if you could convince two guys to go along with this, that's the problem.
Yeah, it's the same thing for men too, who have all these other kinds of silly movie fantasies. Yeah, in different ways.
I want my wife to be a spy and go on adventures with me. It's like, okay, maybe.
And she's incredibly young and attractive.
That's right.
And doesn't criticize or comment anything about my behavior whatsoever. That's like the dream.
Yeah. So we were talking about cultural structures. So first we start out with, apes and chimpanzees and how they have like harem versus like semen competition. And then we talked about cultures that are like harem cultures versus monogamy cultures. And so Jordan Peterson got in some hot water because he was talking about enforced monogamy, and people misinterpreted that to mean like, women are being handcuffed and treated as slavery and like forced to be monogamous.
Yeah.
But he was talking about cultural structures and systems that encourage monogamy, partly because it creates stability.
Right. Maybe instead of like enforced, you could use, what was the word we used last time with consent, not manufacturing.
Well,
and just incentivize it.
Yeah, well, it's a cultural structure.
Yeah.
So it's incentivized or standardized through a cultural structure. And I mean, at least in recent years, it's an interesting question because like gay marriage has become legal, and now people are also having like polyamorous relationships, and it's our culture's like in this weird place of like creativity and questioning, and at the same time a lot of chaos.
Yeah. I mean, it's so complicated now because there's like so much technology of birth control. It's not a matter of do you want to be, or it's not like the risk that you might have a child or whatever when you engage in this thing. I guess not so much for gay marriages.
There's the HIV thing.
There is that. That's true. But now there's like so much control. It's just like, do I want to have a kid? And that's just a total rational thing. And you can still continue to behave in such a way. So there's a lot of stuff that's just radically changed in modern culture that just like, you have to have a prefrontal cortex to like figure things out. And it's much less about these internal drives that may have been historical.
Right. And now there's these questions of like how much do we keep as like our natural course of biology
Mm-hmm.
versus, what's our choice and like where are the limits of technology. The classic example is the Catholic Church
Mm-hmm.
is had outlawed contraception.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, hey, this is a technology, and yeah, don't use contraception.
Right.
They stick with nature, and it's like, I mean, I can appreciate that. It's like this is how we're meant to pair bond, and so
Mm-hmm.
let's keep that pattern. I
Mm-hmm.
remember watching this show. It irked me. It really, really annoyed me. So there were these activists. This is, I think, during the 80s,
Mm-hmm.
and they staged this protest at a Catholic church,
Mm.
and they were blaming the Catholic Church for spreading AIDS because they outlawed
Oh
contraception.
my goodness.
It seemed so absurd, so
Yeah.
stupid to me because it's like, okay, you're engaging in gay sex, which the Catholic Church said not
Right.
cool.
Right.
So you're breaking that rule, and then you're blaming them because they say don't use contraception.
Yeah.
Like you're picking and choosing the rules that you're following here, and like, anyways, it seemed ridiculous to me.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. Yeah. I mean, at some point, you got to take responsibility for what's going on. But the technology is getting to such a place where reproduction can now be completely asexual. Like everyone can just be sterilized, and we can just take genes and put them in a petri dish, get the process started. Totally fine. So that the concept of like reproduction now is almost not almost, but I can see within 50 years, 100 years, doesn't matter. So then all that matters is what do we want to feel and experience. So the whole reproduce thing from evolutionary standpoint has become
Obsolete.
totally obsolete.
Mhm.
So then how do you form a society and live life, and like it becomes pretty crazy and weird.
Yeah, well, and there's definitely sci-fi stuff about that. There's actually really interesting animes. I'm trying to think of a couple. I also don't want to spoil too many plots, but
Mhm.
but there's definitely like envisioning societies where people are just cloned.
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't need any new people, so we're just gonna
Mm-hmm.
like clone people. When you die, we'll create another clone.
There's a Star Trek episode on that one too.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
I think they wanted to start cloning Riker, and he's like, "Hey, whoa, whoa," or something like that. Do you remember that?
Yeah, like they needed new genes.
Yeah. They like were stealing their genes and like cloning them.
Yeah. So you definitely have some weird permutations on or what it means to be human, and yeah, what does a relationship even mean?
Mm-hmm.
What's a family even mean?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part of what our culture is going through, and I mean, that's part of why we're having these conversations to get the collective intelligence of humanity to figure this stuff out.
Yeah, I guess a major trend of it is all of these like sexuality, evolution, reproduction, survival. These are all like biological processes that have like naturally evolved through this Darwinian evolution.
Mhm.
And now it's getting to a point where we can start, making dogs by actively selecting which ones to breed, and like that's like the first artificial control of biology.
Mhm.
But now it's getting so technical. It's getting down to like the DNA level, and we can do all these kind of manipulations, and it's totally separate from the normal biological process. So if we have that kind of control of the biology, it becomes this weird loop because the biology was kind of determining behaviors and incentives. But now, if that piece is disrupted, what does that look like? Or hacked, what does that look like? Very strange. But that's what science fiction is good, because it can maybe look at possible like a good outcome, bad outcome, dystopian, different ways. I haven't thought about that too much, but as we discussed today, it seems like it's an interesting thing to explore.
Yeah, well, something that just occurred to me too is if you have a materialist view and you think that ethics is rooted in biology, and you were able to hack biology, could you then not hack ethics?
Right, right. If you really go down that loop of causality, and maybe the Catholic Church saying, "Hey, no condoms," it's a similar thing. This is like technology, like you said, that's intervening in the biological process, and it's a hack. You're hacking nature. It's a pretty simple hack, but you know, yeah, really fascinating. I guess there's even simpler hack which they use in the churches too, with the eunuchs.
Oh
That
yeah,
would attend
literal
to
hacks.
literally hacked. Yeah.
It reminds me of so in Robin Hood Men in Tights, they had instead of Friar Tuck, it was Rabbi Tuck, and he had this sign saying "Special deal on circumcisions, half off."
That's right. Oh my gosh, Mel Brooks, brilliant. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, but like the whole point of those eunuchs was to make sure, because I guess they were keeping after the maidens or something.
The queen and the princesses, yeah, make sure there's no hanky panky.
Right. Just absolute certainty. Yeah.
No competition.
That's really wild. And then there's the whole thing. I mean, I guess this has probably gone on for a long time, but like, in terms of biology and technology, there's like in vitro fertilization, and there's like surrogate motherhood, and then there's this whole a lot of adoption is now being more promoted. I don't know if that's a technology, but I feel like adoption is so much more common now. Maybe I could be wrong about that.
I think adoption is going on for a long time.
Yeah.
Like it takes a village to raise a child idea. And if you can imagine humans living in tribal society, like people are dying left and right all the time. And then the child just becomes like a citizen of the tribe.
Right, right.
But in that world, like everybody knows everybody, and there's this like deep connection and common bond within everybody.
Yeah. Right, and if there's like an abandoned child or something, it's just like they're inherited and welcomed into the tribe or something like that. But now I guess with society and the technology, this adoption process seems to have become so much more sterile.
Yeah.
It's like, let's put in an application and on our shopping list or something. This is like a human being.
Right. It really annoys me when you have some celebrity types who get kids as like accessories.
Yeah.
Like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we adopted a poor African child? It's like
I don't know what's going on in their heads, but it's applaudable.
It is compassionate, but it also seems, and who knows what's going on in
like
their
that
minds.
virtual signal
Yeah,
thing. But I can imagine that could be a motive, and if that's the case, not cool. But that's a difficult one when it comes to the kids.
And statistically speaking, like people who are certified like psychopaths and narcissists, like it's pretty low. I mean, it does happen, but it's pretty low. Yeah, like in general, anyone who's willing to take care of a kid, like that's a pretty significant investment. And that's noble. Then the flip side of the coin is, in terms of research, it turns out that step parents tend to be more aggressive towards their kids than biological parents, which fascinatingly enough ties into the whole fairy tale of like the wicked stepmother or the wicked stepfather.
Yeah, I think that it goes right into the whole cuckold thing, right?
Yeah,
it's like, why am I going to invest in this person that has nothing to do with my genes at all, even when they become old.
But not consciously.
Yeah, right. Like they're not just thinking that. Like, who thinks that? You don't have my genes.
Well, they didn't even know what genes were.
Right.
They call it like blood. Like, you have my blood.
Right.
My flesh and blood.
Yeah, it's gonna get interesting. It's already interesting.
Well, one thing I understand for young people that's really frustrating is all the dating apps.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the challenge is that women tend to be choosy in
Mm-hmm.
terms of who they select. And when you have like all of the internet available to you, you're going to start picking the top of the list.
Yep.
And so you get these like young sexy women who go on these like cruises with billionaires, and you have this swath of like average decent guys
Mm-hmm.
who find it like impossible to get a date.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen some guys too that I'm just like, he's like handsome, he's ripped, he's got money, and he's with this woman who's like mediocre.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, man, what's going on with that?
Yeah.
And I think it's this crazy sexual
It's
marketplace.
it's a big part of it. I mean, and that the whole like dating app thing is very akin to what I was just saying. When you're like adopting a child, it's like on the shopping list now as a checkbox, not like a relationship thing. Now it's like, oh no, don't want that, don't want this. And just like treating people like commodities.
Right.
Yeah, and then the incentive structures like that for sure. That's been seen hugely in the data in terms of yeah, women tending to go for like the top 1%
Mm-hmm.
of all of the males on the apps, and basically they're complaining about it because that kind of alpha male is going to be ignoring you and just like seeing like multiple women, and they're not happy, and then the average males on the things aren't happy because then no one wants to see them. So it's just a very interesting situation that's developed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think it's great. But that's just kind of where the market goes or is right now.
Yeah, the culture/market.
Yeah, slowly sliding down the slope of idiocracy.
Maybe. Yeah, it's tough. I feel for younger people, and I know there's also a pretty. My understanding is that there's a big move to get back to church, because it's like you meet people in person and you have some shared values,
Yeah.
and there's a smaller pool, but maybe that's good.
Yeah, and the authentic part is probably more there.
Mm-hmm.
On these dating apps and all this technology, you get filters, you can do AI thing, you can make yourself look like anything or anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And this all, what is that, catfishing?
Mm-hmm.
Very common. It's just, and who do you trust? It's just weird. But if you just go to a place and there's people there, it's like, okay, I can feel this. It's here. I can see it with my eyes. It's there is, I think, some value in that it's slowly slipping away.
And I think it's possible for dating app people to adjust their algorithms. And ideally what they could do, call me up if you want a consultant. What you could do is you could create like tiers of engagement, where it's like, okay, at this tier, you're just kind of getting to know people. At this tier, you're like building a relationship. And then at like this tier, you're going to like start getting closer. So you're like mirroring this progressive intimacy on the app that you would ideally experience in person. I mean, some people do that organically, but to have like that structure built in might be useful.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of already there, but you kind of have to like read everyone's little bio, because it's like, what are you interested in right now? It's like short-term friendship, whatever, long-term. So you get an idea. You can kind of self-filter that way. But people can just write whatever they want.
That's true.
And they can say, like, this. So this is also the horrible thing that happens pretty often, or that I've read, is, men will be much more likely to lie about being interested in a long-term thing.
Or how much money they have.
Because they'll get more clicks.
Yeah.
And that's all that matters. But totally false pretenses, and all it is just writing it or checking the box. Oh yeah, I want to get married as soon as possible and find the right lady. Yeah, really? It's not. I mean, and anyone can do that at any time. But these online kinds of platforms make it so much easier, and like the repercussions of lying about it are so much less, I feel like. Than if it's like someone in your community that and there's like some mutual relationship, some kind of church structure, and if you pull that on someone in that community, your reputation is on the line. But if it's just like on an anonymous dating app, who's gonna know or care or anything? Just like you're just another drop in the sea of fish.
8 billion fish.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that definitely, I think, need to be addressed I don't know how, but
There's another challenge too. I think I mentioned the anxious generation. That's Haidt's most recent book, where he talks about young people growing up on social media and being anxious because you make a mistake, it's on the internet forever, and like everyone's gonna like you know all this social aggression and like mean girls, but like across the internet.
right, cyberbullying has become a huge thing.
Yeah, and I think a lot of young people have difficulties in terms of social skills. Like there's a lot more social anxiety and people don't even know how to like have a conversation and like interact as well. So I mean there are people, they're great people out there. They're producing, resources and opportunities, and thank God we're COVID's over and we're like interfacing in human flesh again. But yeah, we're in a weird, very strange place culturally.
Yeah, right. And the human brain and the human species has a remarkable capacity to adapt to changing environments rapidly. I think that's my opinion on what makes humans human. They got like, it's the language and the tool making. No, I think it's the ability to adapt rapidly to changing environments and thrive. And that's been true for a long time. But I think the farther you depart from kind of the natural environment that the genes and the human species had evolved in, it takes a little more CPU power to get that to run smoothly. And our PFC or CPU can only take so much like artificial, like rational reasoning, and basically like totally suppressing all of these urges and drives that initially were helpful for survival. So we're going into this place where it's like all virtual and deep fakes AI. And dating, it means something totally different, and all of these incentives are just so strange. You can learn that and you can adapt, but you're gonna be overheating your CPU, I think. Probably have a lot more people showing up at the therapist's office. Not sure why, but I'm anxious, I'm stressed, I'm in all of these things.
Oh yeah, no, the data seems to be in that. Yeah, I think the book is called The Anxious Generation. That's the title of his book.
Yeah.
And yeah, people are definitely having a hard time. And it's the difficulty, I think, is that the change is accelerating. When change happens slowly, then culture can adapt to it. But when change happens really, really, really fast, like it becomes more and more difficult to cope.
Yeah. I think maybe if the changes happened on like a generational pace, at least like one generation is kind of used to this, it's stable within one lifetime, maybe. But now, like within a single generation, like there's these huge dramatic shifts, and like I was born pre-internet, and now there's internet, and it's just like within a single developmental maturity, there's like these huge shifts in how people engage in socialization and stuff like that. So like it's like confusing for the biology, but it's also confusing for the model. Like, okay, this is how the world works. And so actually, you're in a totally different world now with all these different rules, and this is how it works. And you have to like,
remain calm,
and carry on. Yeah, I was trying to think of there's a great word about like navigating with, both of those worlds in some way. But I don't think the problem is getting
balancing order and chaos.
Maybe balancing order. How do you? I'll kick myself once I think of the word, but it's fine. The problem isn't getting better; it's getting worse, and it's getting worse more quickly. And I think maybe so with the whole AI thing, there was that big letter that went out that was like a cease and desist plea to humanity. Did you hear about that?
I know Elon Musk has been pushing for that for a long time.
Yeah, well, there's a huge thing that came out that's like, okay, we need to stop this AI stuff because we don't understand it well enough, and it's not good. They don't even care about all of this like social stuff that we're talking about. It's just like literally like a existential crisis of we won't be able to control this thing once it's out of the bag.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is we can't even if it was totally controllable and all that, it's just changing the way we live life so much that how does anyone know how to deal with it? You can ask it, hey, write me a 20-page essay or whatever on this topic, and bam, get you something very well written and super credible. Like, that kind of capacity is just wild. Or
Well, in terms of the market, even it's like, what's the value of human labor and ingenuity? Like that's like in total flux.
there was a South Park episode, which I love. That's another great show. Probably that and like Star Trek have some of the greatest social commentaries. But Stan was messaging his girlfriend Wendy, and then he found this Chat GPT thing, and so he was messaging Wendy all of these, like, send her a really nice message that they would want to hear. And there was like this whole thing back and forth, and Wendy's like, "Oh, Stan is the most kindest, understanding man I've ever met. I'm gonna marry this guy." And he's sitting there playing like his Xbox and just like AI chat with Wendy or whatever.
Yeah.
And it was just setting up this thing of like, there's something about actually putting something down on paper and doing it that means something.
Yeah.
We can't be living in this kind of false like setup forever. There's got to be some kind of head. Got to come to some kind of head with it.
Well, I know one of my big things is in terms of math, I think it's really useful to work it out on paper. Just like write it out as like part of your thinking. It slows you down and it helps you to like visualize what's happening, and it helps you to keep track of the steps you're doing. And it's almost like a mental, I don't know, like martial art that just writing out by hand is part of the practice. And I totally agree that, and I think science backs this up, what you practice becomes like part of your nervous system. Like it digs the grooves in your brain. So when you put effort into doing something, it actually changes you and hopefully improves you over time.
100% agree. There's something about the visceral act of doing it that will help your thinking and the way that you yourself develop. But I think it becomes even more insidious when you're trying to like pawn off something as something you have done, or now it's just like
like a forgery or a,
I mean, if it were or like in this
kind
South
of
Park thing, maybe I'll just set up a Johnny chat bot that when anyone texts me, I'll train it on what I would normally say and just have this chat bot talk to everyone. And then at the end of the day, the chat bot will tell me, you know, who's saying what, it can get kind of creepy. I could imagine.
Yeah.
And then it's like, I don't want to talk to people anymore. I'll just have the AI say the perfect thing. I can imagine it going down that road with all the social media and these dating apps and just a breakdown of social communication in like a meaningful way, not having to work at it, I guess.
Yeah. And then atrophy.
Yeah. Right. That was the main idea. But all of this topic was revolving around, evolution, sexual reproduction. Kind of interesting how we came all the way from that topic to something like this.
Cyber dating or whatever.
Or yeah, just ideas about interacting and how technology is having such an impact on it. And everything we know about evolution and reproduction, survival, is based on these biological processes that are now being hacked a lot. Or even like the interactions in people, Typically hacks have been thought of as like, they can be very innovative, right? And improve.
Yeah, and they're designed to save you time. It's interesting too, because like if you get someone that's super productive, like they can like maximize and optimize their work. But if you get someone who's deliberately trying to avoid work, they can use the same technology to like slough off and avoid.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, I mean, it's great that we're enabling these super productive people, but we're also enabling freeloaders. And I guess that's the main problem with the dating app is like, how do you have this accountability? Like, how do you know it's real? How do you know that you're like using it in the highest, best way?
Right. It's always when the new innovation comes out, there's kind of growing pains and figuring out good uses and bad uses, and then being able to identify when people are up to no good. When you talk about sloughing off of work, I was just thinking of a Simpsons episode where Homer was supposed to be monitoring the nuclear plant, and his job was basically to push a button repeatedly. So then he got one of those like little birds that like
Oh yeah,
tip
yeah.
back and forth, and just he kept pressing. So that was the Homer Simpson hack.
Right.
That didn't end well in the episode, but it was quite funny. What do you think? Anything more you'd like to add on to, or more thoughts?
Well, just one final thought, I guess, that just occurred to me is that's really the whole premise of Star Wars. Like if you think about the first episode, right? The villain is this like man human hybrid monster.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, Luke is sort of trying to be in touch with the Force.
Mm-hmm.
And at the climax of the movie, he's supposed to like use this mechanical device to like target the Death Star and blow it up. But Obi-Wan Kenobi says, you know, trust your feelings.
Right.
And,
well, even and Luke was raised on like a farm out in the middle of nowhere that was low tech,
right,
as well.
Right. Yeah. So the theme there is just saying, you know, you've got to figure out how to trust yourself and don't be over reliant on technology.
Yeah. You put away the targeting scanner.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. You know, he has R2-D2 and C-3PO. They're his friends, but he's getting in touch with his feelings. So that's like the theme of that movie.
Yeah, I think I like it a little better now. Never a big Star Wars fan. I was too cheeseball. But
a lot of it's mythological, for sure.
Yeah. I know George Lucas interacted with
Joseph
Campbell quite a bit on that. And that was like his whole point, was to do that in space. Yeah.
All right.
You think we're good?
Yeah, for sure. And we've discussed a lot. Make comments. I'll put a bunch of links. And always be curious.
Always be curious. Thanks, everyone.